Welcome to lesson number 2 of week 1, and today we're going to talk about various kinds of test styles. Of course, if you've ever done test styles before, you are probably familiar with a lot of those test styles. However, I just wanted to go over it and introduce you to maybe some new ideas or maybe cover some material that you have not heard about. The first type of test styles is flat test styles. This is the most generic, the easiest type of test styles available out there, and I picked them up from the ceramic materials course that I took with Matt Katz. He recommended those because they do save a lot of storage space. Once you begin testing over and over and over again, you realize that yes, the space in your studio is limited, and the self-supporting tests that we're going to talk about a bit later do take up a lot of space, and it's really nice to just stack them together and store them somewhere. Alternatively, you could hang them on the wall and create a gigantic wall of test styles. That's the way I did it. I used the double-sided tape. However, I think if you make a hole and use a nail, then that might be another good option. The process of making those test styles is pretty straightforward. I just roll out the slab approximately half a centimeter, maybe a centimeter thick, which is about half an inch thick. And then I cut the test styles using X-Acto knife in the exact length and width that I'd like. If you are normally using various clay bodies, it is definitely a good idea to make test styles using various clay bodies, whether you'd like to test something on a specific clay body or maybe you just like it. I do recommend choosing several different clay bodies and try the technique that you're going to try on different clay bodies. You will discover that one material might look much better on a certain clay body, or it might melt a little differently than on the other clay body, and you might like it a lot more. As you can see on this slide, I make my test styles to be very different in size. I do like the shorter test styles just for aesthetic purposes. However, in terms of function, they're all kind of the same. For the lava glaze that we're going to cover later, the bigger test styles are no bit better because lava glaze specifically behaves a bit differently on a larger surface compared to on a very small surface. Those flat test styles require a support structure. So as you can see here, a support structure is not a very difficult thing to make. It's just two slabs joined together by a coil. Again, you can watch a demo on how I make this in this week. Otherwise, it is a pretty straightforward process. You could throw the supporting structure, but I wouldn't recommend it just because it doesn't come out to be as straight or as nice as you'd like. The structure should be a tiny bit shorter than the regular test styles and a little bit wider so that the test styles could stand at a, 30 to 45 degree angle. The main idea behind the support structure is to fire the test styles vertically. Some of the things that you're going to try do not require vertical firing. Horizontal firing might be enough. However, some of the things that might run or might look differently when fired vertically would require the support structure. Vertical firing does imitate real-life scenario of you having an object that's vertical instead of a horizontal object. And again, a lot of the things like aggregates or slips, they kind of look the same, whether they're fired vertically or horizontally, but some other things do require the vertical firing. This support structure can be reused over and over again, and I normally make because this bottom side right here catches the runniness of the glaze or of the rocks, so it is proving to be particularly useful. Self-supporting test styles. Why do we really need those? Those, again, are one of the most common types of test styles out there. They're convenient. They're catching the runniness of the glaze for sure. And they're also self-supporting. So they do save some space in the kiln. Similar to the supporting structure in the previous slide, this structure also saves some space in the kiln, because if you put your flat test styles flat on your kiln shelf and you have to keep a certain distance between your kiln shelves, it's not really that many test styles that you can fit in one shelf. However, if you fire them vertically, it does save space in the kiln. This kind of test styles, unfortunately, do take up a lot of space in the storage. So they're less convenient to store, but they're also fun and pretty. To carve or not to carve your test tiles? The answer to this question depends on your purpose. What exactly are you testing? Are you testing one specific material or how it would look like on a test tile when combined with carving? Then sure, of course, you can test it there. If you're testing glazes, that's a different story. The only thing that the carving does is it creates various levels of thickness of the glaze. So wherever you see a non-carved surface, the top surface, the glaze is going to be thinner than if it pulls into your carved surface. So you could do that, or you could test the different layers of slip or of glaze in a different way and in a more systematic way. So it does create an uneven surface and might not be particularly useful, but it really just depends on what you're trying to test. The next type of test tiles that I'd like to discuss is these little sugar balls. And those balls are used for various types of firings, especially when firing dangerous materials. They're not that dangerous, but the things that you are trying for the first time, especially rocks or some kinds of sands, you create a little ball, you put the material inside, and you create a lid to put it on top. The lid does not have to be airtight, or it's better for it not to be airtight so that the material inside can be fired. However, the lid prevents the material from exploding and running throughout your whole kill. So that adds a little bit to the safety of your firing. I use it when testing rocks and sand and some glazes that might result in pooling. So if you want a very, very thick layer of glaze, this test tile might be convenient for you. Once you're done with the most basic test tiles and with the first round of tests, it is nice to consider a tiny object for you to test, especially if you have some kind of interesting product that you're creating from time to time on which you can dump the rest of your glazes or some of the materials. Again, it is useful because some glazes and some materials look differently when they are located on a large surface area compared to a small surface area. Also, if the surface area is curved, that might also alter the results that you're going to get. And as another bigger idea, some of the people create a kind of a challenge for themselves. For example, the White House came up with this amazing project that's called 100 Bottles in 100 Days. She also did another one, 100 Beetles in 100 Days, that look amazing. She just made 100 bottles, and every day she carved it in a different way. So that's another interesting thought of how you can add to your experimentation and how you can add some system into your artistic process that might help you develop your style and your techniques a little bit more. Some of the other considerations for the test tiles, of course, the test tiles themselves are important. However, it is very often necessary to add a cookie underneath the test tile, especially again if you're testing some unknown rock or unknown glaze that might potentially run. A cookie is a flat piece of clay that's been fired before or an old kiln shelf. All of this you put under your test tiles and it helps preserve the kiln shelf and the kiln elements. As I mentioned before, testing various clay bodies in a systematic way is also a very nice idea, very useful. Many rocks and glazes look different when applied to the surface. In terms of chemistry, the clay bodies do not affect the materials that are on top of it that much. However, the look is affected because the light is reflected in a little bit different way, depending on which materials you apply to the surface or into the clay body. You could also consider making different test tiles. First of all, greenware, and then fire it to bisque temperature, about cone 04 to cone 06 or 08. Or potentially you could also create a test tile that's been fired to the temperature that you normally fire to, whether it's cone 6 or 8 or 10, on maybe even a glazed surface. So you could have a whole range of different test tiles on top of which you could apply materials in various ways. So depending on your style and on the results you want to get, I do like to have a whole range of test tiles available that I make before I start testing to be able to test whatever I like. Of course, if you're testing various clay bodies, it is important to write down what kind of test tiles you create, whether it's this or that clay body and whether you fired it or not. It does get complicated and overwhelming when you have a lot of unnamed test tiles and you have no idea what you're testing anymore. This is a slide with some of the examples of the test tiles I created. It just shows that there is no universal way of how test tiles could look like. On the left, you can see a bunch of test tiles. Some of them got broken, some of them got lost, but I was testing a specific combination of different glazes that we're going to be talking about in the second part of the course. They're kind of shorter, but they're not as pretty and as straight as you might imagine. The second test style is interesting. I was testing different kinds of Egyptian paste and the glue. I was modifying the recipe to fit my own needs. And in theory, the recipe that I found originally was supposed to melt through these little holes. However, it did not melt, and as a result, the experiment kind of failed, but at the same time, I got the result, and any result is the result. However, this test style I created specifically for this purpose to see how this glue glaze or the Egyptian paste that I got instead of a glue glaze would melt and for how far it would melt through the hole. On the right, you can see how the test style that I created here looks completely different than the test with the same glaze when applied to a larger vase. Just because of a larger surface area and maybe a bit thicker layer, everything changed and looks completely different from what I got right here. This is the end of lesson 2. If you'd like to watch the demonstration on how I make different test styles, you can watch the next lesson. Otherwise, you can skip and go ahead and watch my thoughts on why a systematic approach is important and how to record your test styles so that you do not forget them.